Okay, good again. All right, thank you everyone, and thank you for joining us here at UXPA for our first webinar of 2021. I want to thank you guys again for joining. A few housekeeping items. You'll notice that everyone who has joined is on mute. If you do have questions for Teresa, she will have a Q&A at the end of the webinar, but feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A so that we can pick them up and have her address those. Another thing, this is recorded. So this is recorded. The recording will be made available on the UXPA website. Also, if you've registered, you should get an email with a link to this as well. Next thing, please join us for our next webinar. We have diary studies, which is upcoming. It will be a Portuguese webinar as well as an English webinar. So please be ready, prepared to tune into that one. And then join us again for Teresa's short course. So if you like what you've heard today, if you want to get your feet wet in designing for trauma in user experience design, feel free to join Teresa for the short course. The short course is coming up in February, and it kicks off February 12th. So February 12th, that's the right date, right, Teresa?
Yes. And I would say, even if you don't like what you hear, join the short course anyway and let me know. I'm always open to feedback, so.
For sure. A little bit about Teresa. She's a multidisciplinary designer. She's been crafting meaningful experiences across a broad range of industries. Those include retail, healthcare, consumer electronics, and most currently, she's doing wealth management at Northern Trust here in Chicago. I've had the pleasure of meeting Teresa through her former consultancy, Colored. She's always been a fierce activist and an advocate for people of color in the design industry. And I'm just very excited to have her here with us today. So without further ado, Teresa, I'm going to have you take it away.
All right, let me share my screen.
And then I'm going to turn my video off.
Awesome. Can you see that? Are we good to go? I'm going to take that silence as a yes. Awesome. Sorry, what screen are you seeing? Are you seeing the large screen?
We are seeing the large screen.
Yep. Okay, awesome. Okay, just want to make sure. I'm like working off 2 monitors, so I'm trying to make sure I get the right one. All right, thank you so much for that intro, Carm. And I want to thank everybody else for coming today. I do want to say we are here together, I believe, for an hour. Be prepared to essentially drink from like a fire hose of information, but don't worry about taking too many notes or getting too caught up. There's going to be time, as Carm said, at the end for questions and answers. And also there'll be a recording of this presentation. And I believe I also have a version of the presentation that I can put up to share. That way, if you want to use it as a reference. So I definitely want to take some time to just actually formally thank you to UXPA and for Carmen for inviting me to speak today on this experience. It's something I'm just really passionate about. And so Carmen gave you a little bit about me. I like to honestly describe myself. I'm a design practitioner. So as she said, I work at Northern Trust as a design lead on their wealth team. But I do design in all sorts of fun fashions, and also I'm a trauma survivor. And so that's why this topic is really, really important to me. So as we go through this webinar, I'll talk a little bit about my experience as a trauma survivor and how that's sort of shown up, not only in my work, but in sort of the careless product design that we see out in the world today. But before we kick off, there's a couple things I want to share. So one, I want to be explicitly clear, and what you're seeing on here is a trigger warning. So I'm just going to read it word for word, just so we're all on the same page. But this webinar and the following short course will have frank and open discussions around various types of trauma, including sexual assault, PTSD and its symptoms, emotional abuse, racial abuse, and other forms of trauma. The purpose of these discussions is to illuminate taboo topics and show how re-traumatization occurs. These discussions may overwhelm and trigger you, especially if you are a trauma survivor. And I'm asking everyone here to create an atmosphere of mutual respect and sensitivity for everyone that is attending today. And if at any point, and I want to stress this, it becomes too much, feel free to please take a break and rejoin if you are able to. But if you are not able to rejoin, that is also totally fine and acceptable. As again, this recording will be shared. There will also be the presentation as well. So if you get overwhelmed and you get triggered, please, please, please take care of yourself. I really want to stress that. And I also want to say, in the discussions of trauma, in the realm of being trauma informed, I will not talk about specifics, because specifics of trauma is what really re-triggers behavior. I will talk about my own experience, but I will make sure not to include too much detail. That way it doesn't inadvertently trigger someone in the audience. So I just want to start with that and just remind everyone that this is, you know, an open, brave space. And yeah, there's no judgment. So don't judge yourself if something happens and you have to back away. That is okay. I also want to share group norms. So if you're not familiar with this concept, group norms are essentially the commitments we make to one another while we're in this space. So we have 4 that I'd like for us to follow today. The first one is to stay engaged, which is about refusing to let your heart and mind sort of check out of the conversation while your body stays present. So it's essentially a personal commitment that each of us is making, kind of regardless of the engagement of others. And it means remaining morally, emotionally, intellectually, and socially involved in the dialogue. And I will know that in this virtual experience, it is like a lot harder. I understand, but it's really just to say, you know, if you have something come up, like feel free to go and deal with that. But don't necessarily, you know, especially when we get to Q&A, kind of like check out while things are happening. The next one is speak our truths. So this one is about using actual examples and experiences that you've had. So don't try to generalize for other people or how they might be feeling. We're here to have real conversations, and have them also means being honest and specific about ourselves and our questions. And it's just a reminder that no one here is expected to be a representative of any sort of group, whether it's your race, gender, sexual orientation. Like, I'm here exposing I'm a trauma survivor, but I definitely do not represent all of trauma survivors. So I will speak my truth and speak from my experiences. The next is patterns of participation, which is just about how everyone's voice is important and valuable in this conversation. So we want to make sure that we're watching our airtime. So this is about challenging yourself. So if you're someone that tends to process internally, we really want to hear what you have to say. So I would challenge you to step up. And then for those of us who tend to process externally or verbal talkers, and I will say this is 100% me, I'm challenging you to take a step back and allow yourself some time for intentional reflection and to make space for others who typically don't speak up. And then last but certainly not least is about embracing impact. So as I mentioned in the trigger warning, we're going to be talking about very uncomfortable and taboo topics. And honestly, many of us are not well versed in these, and we might inadvertently say something harmful or ask a question that's insensitive. And when this happens, kind of resist the urge to defend yourself. And I always like this phrase that diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner friend of mine talks about, which is like assume good intent, which means that everybody knows you didn't mean to do the thing. They know that you were not trying to be harmful, but you were. So embracing impact is about living in that reality and then like moving forward from there without being defensive. So now that we have a little bit of that intro away, a couple of housekeeping items here, I want to move into why we're here. So we're here because we're interested in learning how to be essentially more responsible designers. And so we know that human-centered design is a really, really powerful tool. And while that is true, it doesn't have all the answers, especially when it comes to the subject we're talking about today. So today we want to learn and apply lessons from trauma-informed care to our design work and just make our products more accessible and safer for everyone. So our big goal, which is just setting you up with like some base knowledge and tools to view the work that you have through a trauma lens. And our core objective today is really just to educate and introduce what trauma is and how it can kind of show up in products. So I've just spoken a lot. I do want to check to make, are there any high level questions? And I can't see the chat right now, so Carm, feel free to pipe in that anybody has before we get started. Give it like 30 seconds.
No problem. We have no questions thus far, but again, we'll give you guys 30 seconds to drop a question if you have.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, someone asked, are they allowed to take screenshots of the slides? The good thing is Teresa does have slides for this presentation, and
Mhm.
we will make sure those who are registered will receive those slides.
Yep, and you're more than welcome to take screenshots. There's nothing here I'm sharing that is proprietary. Awesome. Anything else coming through? Or are we good?
We are good. We do have some comments about people being excited and just appreciating the care that you've taken thus far. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I do my best. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So as we begin, I'm going to take us back in time. This is a very lovely GIF from the, I think, 2003 film, The Time Machine, starring Guy Pearce, which is a guilty favorite of mine. But I want us to think back about the autumn of 2016. And at the time, millennial pink was everywhere. I think everyone was playing Pokemon Go. People were obsessed with Harambe, which happened actually in my hometown of Cincinnati. Daniel had a really nice white pair of Vans, and like everyone and their mother was dabbing. So while all this was going on, all these amazing pop culture trends, something else actually happened, which is Facebook in that time re-released their SMS and phone integration. So if you're not familiar with this particular feature, I think it's pretty standard now, but at the time they had taken it away in Messenger. And so by default, it essentially turned on that there was access to all of your call logs and your text messages, pretty much from the entire history of your device. And by that time, I think I had my device like probably about 2.5 years. And with that, they turned on the doubly helpful feature, which is right now on Facebook, I think it used to be called People You May Know. In this integration, it was actually called People You May Want to Get in Contact. And the point was like, oh, here are people you haven't contacted in a long time. So like amidst all the people, a lot of, exes, friends I'd had falling out with, like random Craigslist people, I thought that I think I texted about selling like stuff when I was moving. There was one face that I had hoped to, never see again. And that was the face of the man who raped me about a year or so prior. So the person I hadn't contacted, I hadn't talked to him at this point in over a year, who had violated me in one of the most violent ways, was brought up to Facebook as somebody I might want to contact again. And I want to say, funny enough, before anybody is like, well, why was his number in your phone? I will say that the number was not in my phone. In fact, I had painstakingly gone through my entire years of call logs to delete the number, all of the text message logs, any sort of trace that I could find on my device, to delete it just so something like this wouldn't occur. And this was such a violation because I had gone through all of that experience, and then Facebook reminded me, oh, hey, you might have missed one or two things. And so we're here to let you know, maybe you want to contact this person. And so as one can imagine, if you are a trauma survivor, it triggered my PTSD. So this happened at about 8 in the morning. So I had just started my workday. I was at the office. And if you're unfamiliar with, so PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, of which I am a sufferer. It shows up in a variety of ways. And so I'm not going to talk very sort of specific about symptoms, because that can also trigger people who suffer from PTSD. I actually inadvertently did it to myself, and I gave a similar talk a while ago. But for me, I essentially spent the next 4 to 6 hours really suffering in silence, trying to find spare time to essentially cry in a phone booth at work. And I couldn't tell anybody because I couldn't really verbalize what was going on, and that I needed to go home because I was suffering, sort of a mental health crisis. I wasn't in a place where that was super safe. But I want to address, while this is my experience, I'm not alone. So there are quite a few examples of people who suffer from PTSD or other traumas, that this is an occurrence. So I talked about how I gave a similar talk many years ago about my experience. And I did some research for that talk, and there were a lot of threads on places like Reddit where people had talked about how this had occurred and they didn't know what to do about it. They had like sort of complained about these social media apps and gotten no response. But even outside of the realm of sort of sexual assault, we can think about PTSD with like veterans. So there are quite a few studies about, you know, scrolling through the news or scrolling through Facebook, if you are a veteran and you suffer from PTSD, that seeing all of these images of war can re-trigger your behavior. It can also happen for people who have suffered a loss, maybe a family member, maybe a friend, maybe they died in a traumatic way, and maybe their memory, you know, pops up as like a, oh, 2 years ago or a year ago, you know, this happened, and that can also re-trigger suffering. And last, but you know, certainly not least, or the last example is Black people being inundated with all of the videos on social media of people in our community, you know, being killed for a variety, you know, of factors and reasons, and just having to live with that stress and trauma, and then to see it played out without any warning or any opting in can just create an entire realm of unsafe behavior. I also want us to look at the statistics. So even just looking at these examples, right, it might seem like, oh, well, that's a small percentage of the population. So as you see here, we know that 8 million Americans suffer from diagnosed PTSD. And I think that that's a very specific thing we need to remember. This is PTSD that is diagnosed. There are a lot more people walking around, as you can see by these statistics, who probably have undiagnosed trauma and are experiencing symptoms of PTSD, but don't quite know, and other people don't know how to help them. So if we bring it to the next one, which is 25% of women experience some form of sexual assault or sexual abuse in their life. And this is just general women. Once we start layering on race and class, it becomes an entirely different world and statistic. This number grows much higher. If we look next, so 6 in 10 men, or 60%, suffer some form of trauma in their lifetime. And in addition to that, 5 in 10 women, 50% of women, half of women, are walking around in general also experience some trauma that they suffered in their lifetime. And while the majority of people, you know, may not, I'm trying to say. So we know that the majority of people like are walking around traumatized. And I think these numbers to me are always really interesting, because if we look at that first one, 8 million is only like 2% of Americans, right? And all these statistics, I will say, are coming from the United States. But there has to be many more, because one thing that we don't talk about is actually trauma is an extremely personal experience. And so when I did, you know, some trauma therapy and things like that, one of the big things that we talk about is what might be traumatic to me might not be traumatic to the person that is next to me or anyone else, you know, who's on this webinar. And because of that, it gets really hard to pin down what trauma looks like, because it's such a personalized experience based on a person's lived experience. And in media, we're so inundated with like what trauma is, right? So we think it's something extremely bad, like surviving, you know, like a kidnapping or a crash or something along those lines. But there are lots of ways in which people experience trauma and then dismiss their trauma because like, well, it's not as bad as, you know, insert the examples that I talked about. And while this is important, is because that means there are a whole bunch of people walking around on a moment's notice potentially being triggered. And when I say triggered, I don't mean like the way it's been reused recently, but in the very, very clinical way. So triggered means it could lead to nightmares, which is a very common symptom. It could lead to outbursts in violent behavior. It could lead to relapse in alcoholism or drug abuse or any sort of addiction behavior. It can lead to severe depression. And last but not least, you know, worst case scenario is it can lead to self-harm in which somebody could get seriously or fatally injured. So if we see all of this, right, that's where it becomes really important. It's not just people are going to feel bad, is that there are real life consequences to what happens when somebody gets triggered by a you know, Facebook notification. And I want to talk about too, people associate especially trauma as very much like a mental or mind response. And that actually is not true. So I want to share this great diagram from PSI. And trauma actually, and this is like a there's an additional resource of a book that talks about this really well, but trauma actually like physiologically changes you and changes your brain chemistry and pathways. So what you're seeing here is a diagram of a brain on trauma. So when somebody suffers from trauma, essentially what happens is, so if you look there at the bottom, there is, right, the amygdala. And so the amygdala is kind of your fear center, and we think about the prefrontal cortex, it's like your thinking center. If you are a person who has not suffered trauma, when something happens to you, you'll go through your prefrontal cortex, you'll assess the situation and be like, okay, do I need to have like the trauma response, which is natural to everybody, it's like the fight, like I'm gonna put up and go against it, flight, I'm gonna run away, or freeze, I'm just gonna stop. And then your amygdala is acting appropriately. So it's waiting for your prefrontal cortex to say, hey, is this really dangerous? And then do I need to respond? If you are a trauma survivor, it is actually the opposite. Your fear center is extremely overactive, and that's what takes over all of your functions in your brain. So it's not just that your prefrontal cortex is underactive, it's that the messages you're receiving go straight to your fear center, and then your body responds as if it's in danger all of the time. And there's an author of this book called The Body Keeps the Score. The author, Bessel van der Kolk, gives actually a really great analogy of this that puts it into perspective. So if you think about like a smoke detector going off in your home, for a lot of us, we hear the smoke detector and we're like, okay, yes, the smoke detector is going off, but like, much like me, it's like, maybe I'm burning something I'm making in the oven. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a fire. Let me go assess the situation, decide if I need to call 911. If you are somebody who has suffered trauma, when you hear a smoke alarm go off, it's not that, it's not the question of, is there a fire? The question is, there is a fire, and now what do I do? And so you might call the fire department, you might panic, or you might start to flee. And so that's where this model kind of comes in. There's not a way for the person who's been traumatized, their brain has been so wired that they don't have that thinking center that lets them know, hey, is something really bad actually happening? They just assume it's bad is happening, and then their response like takes over. So that's just a little brief intro on trauma, and especially the sort of physiological connections of trauma, which I think are really important as we go through the rest of the talk today. But if we know all of this to be true, honestly, the big question is, how do we responsibly take this into account as not only humans, but also design practitioners who are making experience for people? So if we know that there are more people walking around in the world with trauma than not, how does that shift how we think about our products and services that we're building? And I think from this perspective, it's really great. We actually don't have to, reinvent the wheel. There are actually quite a few industries that we can start to look at as analogs that already take trauma into account when they're providing care to clients and patients and other people. And all of these industries practice, and some of you might be familiar with this term called what's called trauma-informed care. And so trauma-informed care is defined as understanding and considering the pervasive nature of trauma and how to promote an environment of healing and recovery rather than practices and service that may inadvertently re-traumatize. And that's kind of the big core with trauma-informed care. It's not necessarily that you're going to solve this person's trauma, but the idea is that you are sensitive to the trauma that is happening so that when you provide them care, you're not going to inadvertently re-traumatize them in their experience. And so as we look at some of these industries, I'll talk about how trauma-informed care comes to life. So the first, and I think the most widely known example is healthcare. So healthcare is an industry, I think, at least from my perspective, and again, I'm not like a therapist or anything like that, but it's one of the most pervasive industries where they've really grappled with trauma-informed care and dealing with patients who have suffered trauma. And when I talk about how trauma can show up in a lot of ways, one of the biggest ones that's an indicator in healthcare is noncompliance. So your doctor might tell you, hey, you need to do this, or you need to take this medication, and they have patients who are not doing it. And so initially the question used to be like, well, what's wrong with you? Like, why aren't you taking this medication? I told you to do this, you know that it's good for you. And the way trauma-informed care has shifted healthcare is instead of asking what's wrong with you to the patient, they ask what happened to you. And so they start to unpack, is there an underlying trauma to the treatment is there an underlying trauma, so that the treatment I'm suggesting might be re-traumatizing them, or they might have a aversion to it. So if I can understand that, then we can work together to understand what's the best treatment method going forward that's sensitive to what they've been exposed to. And I think one of the biggest examples I've seen of this is there's a place here in Chicago called Chicago Women's Health Center. And it's like obstetric, or not obstetric, it's like gynecological care and care focused on women identifying people. And one of the things that they have is, if when you go in for a pap smear, you can actually insert your own speculum, because they know that to be trauma informed, especially as somebody who maybe survived kind of sexual abuse, you might not want somebody else doing that to you. So they give you the option, show you how to do it, and say, hey, you can do this yourself, so that you know you're in control of like what's going on. In addition to the trauma informed care, it's a lot of like constant consent informed care. So it's like, I'm going to do this thing. Do you consent to this happening? And that's really all about creating a safe environment, which is like the next way that this shows up in healthcare. So even though we know that just like trauma, what makes people feel safe is a very, very personal experience, the idea is to train your staff to create an environment that highlights that. So you want the environment to be calming for all the patients, and you also want every patient to understand that they're in control of their care. And control is a big thing, because a lot of trauma survivors, that's kind of the big trigger, is that this idea of lack of control caused something to happen. And so healthcare can be a really scary experience, because it's like, well, I have to go into this machine, I don't know if I want to do that, it feels like out of control. So a lot of trauma informed healthcare is about saying, hey, you can consent to do this activity or not, I'm going to walk you through it, you're going to be completely informed about what's going on, and I'm never going to do anything that you are not comfortable with. So outside of healthcare, we also have wellness, and wellness is really interesting because it practices both trauma-informed care and is also a treatment for those who have suffered from trauma. And so here, when we talk wellness, that's a really wide industry. And so for this example, I'll talk specifically about the idea of like meditation and mindfulness. And so the wellness industry takes trauma into account when they're talking through kind of treatment options for their patients. And so the biggest case of this is meditation. So meditation is actually not great for people who have suffered through trauma. There's a lot of discussion and studies about that, and a lot about, meditation, about sort of being quiet and trying to quiet your mind is really kind of difficult for quite a few traumatized people. And so instead of meditation, they would recommend mindfulness. And mindfulness is actually one area that is, it's pretty much it's the treatment that people talk about with trauma. And the way that mindfulness differs from meditation is it's all about bringing you into the present. And why that is helpful for trauma survivors is because a lot of what happens when we look in the brain is confusing the present with the past. And so mindfulness is about how do you root yourself in this moment so that you can activate, like your prefrontal cortex and make a logical choice about what's actually happening. And so that's a couple ways where it shows up in wellness. And then we know that social workers are also trained to handle trauma and in trauma-informed care. So social workers, again, much like all of these other industries, work with a wide variety of people who have experienced different types of traumas. So the way that trauma-informed care shows up in social work is this understanding of personal histories. So social workers are encouraged to, look at the whole person in order to understand their vulnerabilities and triggers. And the biggest idea here is to foster trust and build a deeper understanding of needs. And so when I say looking at the whole person, the idea could be if a social worker is working with a child or an adult who suffered a lot of housing insecurity, when they were young, they might say, okay, well, we're not going to put them in a situation where we're, in the child's case, bouncing them around from like foster home to foster home to foster home, because that lack of security and having a safe space to go is going to re-traumatize them, and their trauma could show up again as like non-compliance or being very quote unquote difficult to work with, when really it's like they have all of these internal things going on where they're trapped in like, if I don't have a secure home, then how do I defend myself? And so they might be constantly sort of stuck in that experience and moment. And then they also are encouraged to tailor treatments and interventions. So again, if they know that a client they're working with has experienced trauma, like how do they make sure to put that into their intervention. So the example I give here is potentially like a child, right, who experienced a lot of food insecurity. And if that is the case, the social worker might tell the family that takes the child in, the foster family, to say like, hey, don't judge or scold the child for how much food they consume because they suffered from food insecurity. And so instead of saying, well, stop eating so much, you can be a little more trauma informed and say, hey, reassure them that they're always going to have food here, that it's always going to be available, and that the food source that they're experiencing is stable, and use that to help calm and ease them and put them on a path that, again, builds a trust and relationship. It also helps them not react in this like scarcity mentality. So seeing these examples of how trauma-informed care shows up in these industries, we can actually look at, it's boiled down to some kind of 5 core principles of trauma-informed care. So the first, which we talked about quite a bit, is about safety. And so that's about ensuring, physical and emotional safety through so when we look at trauma-informed care, it's really for like healthcare providers. So it's like making sure your common areas are very welcoming, and also make sure that like privacy is respected. So again, if somebody doesn't want to do something or they want to be by themselves, that's totally fine. They don't want to answer a question, they don't have to. The next is choice, which is an individual has a choice and control through clear and appropriate messaging on their rights and responsibilities. Next is collaboration, which is making decisions with the individual and sharing power through allowing an individual to play a significant role in their planning and evaluating services. The next is trustworthiness, which is about task clarity, consistency, and interpersonal boundaries through maintaining professional and respectful boundaries. And that's another big thing, in addition to lack of control, is a violation of boundaries. And so a lot of trauma-informed care is built around like reminding them that there are boundaries, not only from provider to patient, but also patient to provider, that will not be crossed. And that's from a very respectful perspective. And then the 5th principle is empowerment, which is about prioritizing empowerment and skill building, providing an atmosphere that allows individuals to feel validated and affirmed at each and every contact, and in this case, like with the agency. So when we think about empowering, it's saying, yes, how can we use skill building so that, again, when something happens, your brain has the time to you're building the skills to assess what's happening. So sort of like pressure testing and skill building to help people not operate sort of in that trauma mindset. And with all of these examples of trauma-informed care and the principles, we have seen that abiding by these principles in these industries have actually led to better outcomes. So there are real benefits to doing trauma-informed care. There's improved health outcomes for patients, including like better compliance, reduce, relapse into drugs and alcohol use. There's also been some suggestion that it's not just helpful for patients, but it's also helpful for practitioners, because once a practitioner knows that, has been trained in trauma-informed care and knows how to do interventions with a person who's been traumatized, it can actually reduce turnover and burnout amongst the practitioners. The idea being, right, and we've all, I would say, even experienced this in our own life, when it's like, oh my gosh, I'm just trying to get, one person to do this thing. You get really tired and you eventually give up. Same thing happens to health practitioners when you're dealing with a patient who's been traumatized. If you don't know that's what's going on, you're probably sitting there just getting tired because you're constantly doing the same thing over and over again. And so by being trauma informed, once you can shift the narrative and shift the conversation, that's going to save you from doing the same thing over and over again, because you're both working on a level playing field and a shared understanding. So from here, now that we've seen the principles and we've understood how it shows up in other industries, I want to take some time to run us through how we might actually start to leverage this idea of trauma-informed care and create an experience around trauma-informed design and using it in our work when we leave here today. So first and foremost, avoiding re-traumatization is actually all about holistic thinking, which I know we've all probably heard in design. And I want to stress it today because I think one of the things with human-centered design that I've experienced and witnessed is it's really great when it comes to doing research and being able to categorize and simplify people into a single problem space or even a single group. But in order to successfully be trauma informed, we have to change this concept. We can't just categorize people as even traumatized and not traumatized. We have to look at how the whole person interacts with what we're building. Because the truth is, even if we reduce someone to a single problem space, it's not just that reason they're coming to our product or service, right? So that might be why they're going there, but they still bring their whole selves. And so in order for us to reduce harm in our design, we need to acknowledge that whole self. And so first, when I think about human-centered design, I would encourage us to start moving beyond the personas. And I think while personas are very, very useful for establishing patterns, this is one of the ways in which we start to compartmentalize and flatten out who a person is and the fact that they bring themselves to that experience. So if you're going to do things like personas, I would encourage you to add things to them, such as like, how can you layer on other sociological information onto your persona to track like potential traumatic experiences? So if we say connect the dots earlier, if we know that 50% of women are walking around experiencing trauma and your persona is a woman identified person, like how does that then play out into the experience that you're creating? How do you acknowledge in that persona, oh, this person is woman identifying and has more than likely experienced trauma? And again, once we start laying other things, is this like a woman of color? Is this a trans woman of color? What other elements can we start to look at with this and understand like what all the things that they might societally experience? And that part also goes into, with moving on from the persona, is realizing that identity matters. So a lot of times, I know in my work, when we've created personas, we kind of do caricatures and we try to create them without like a specific gender identity, sexual identity, like racial identity or disability identification, or all these other varieties of factors. And this really, again, flattens the work. So people are treated differently based on all sorts of identity classifications. And to remove it from our work is, I would say, at best dishonest and at worst harmful. So by not layering these on and considering this is one way in which we're not really taking into account how an entire person might be impacted by what we're using. So I know this is a lot of information. It's very heavy. So I want to actually, to simplify it for today, give you essentially like 3 considerations or things to ask yourself when you're doing some design work. Like, how can you be a little bit more trauma informed? And since we don't have the time today to go super in depth, I just want to leave you with 3 considerations that will have activities that you can start to practice once you leave here. So this first one is think Black Mirror. And so this consideration is around doing worst case scenario planning for your product. So think about like, what's the worst way this could be used and what traumas might be related to that design that you're working on, whether like directly or tangentially. So especially I think when we work in very like social based applications, think about what happens if somebody were to see, you know, a relative or friend who has passed away, their abuser, an estranged family member, or other sort of connection that I would describe as like less than warm, that they wouldn't be really happy about seeing. Who could those people be and what might that person's reaction be? And how could we handle that as designers? And so the activity I have here, thinking about Black Mirror, is maybe just do a 10 to 15 minute post-it session where you brainstorm how the product might be used to cause harm. And so think through the human response, and that's the key, is like what would happen in these sort of scenarios for your product. So again, deceased relative or friend, allowed like a rapist or an abuser to get into contact with that person, communicated something like an out of control event, like a sudden loss of money, right? Imagine, I think about that in working in financial, like if somebody experienced financial insecurity growing up and then all of a sudden their application was communicating like, all of your money's gone, you know, how might we handle that in a way that doesn't like re-trigger some traumatization? And even thinking about freely playing a traumatic in video involving the user's community, close family member or friend. Or I also think about this a lot in accessibility with like strobe lighting that can trigger seizures. Like all of that are things that we can start to think about when we create a product or service. The next is to think beyond the golden rule. And so we live in an increasingly like connected, global, and diverse society. And that's where I believe that do unto others as you would want to be treated actually doesn't really hold water, because this ultimately puts your own experiences at the center of what it is you're trying to do. And if you are one of the lucky few who's never experienced a trauma, you're not going to know how to handle it, let alone someone's specific type of trauma. So to me, this is where a new rule emerges, where you want to do unto others better than you would actually want to do for yourself. And for this consideration, I think of called the Golden Debate Club, which is, putting your devil's advocate to good use. You can host a 10 to 20-minute debate session where you yourself argue both sides, or you and a partner argue both sides of a feature. Either way it works. I think if you don't have the luxury of being like on a large team where there's someone to do this with, it's also a very useful activity just to do by yourself. And make sure when you're debating this, it's rooted in that demographic and sociological information we talked about, so that you're capturing issues that impact a certain community, and also talking through like the human cost or impact what would happen. So as we talked about, like in my case, seeing my abuser caused me to have a PTSD trigger, which had real like physical dangers and outcomes. And so how do we know what the human cost or impact is if this feature were to like go well or to like go awry? So you can start to play on the spectrum of things to consider. And then last, think about power. I couldn't find a good GIF, so I thought I'd use Palpatine because I feel like he's kind of the perfect villain, which will tie into our next activity. But the biggest thing about thinking about power is looking at the power structures in society. So there's a really great talk, if you haven't listened to it, by George I. of Greater Good Studio, that talks about the power imbalance when it comes to design, where it's kind of like who's funding our projects and who are they being imposed on, and what's that power imbalance. And I think that's like one way to look at this, but a lot of it too is thinking about the power structures that already exist in our society. And when we create a design, think about how what we create might actually be used to harm more marginalized people in society, such as women and trans people, people of color, and other marginalized groups. So the big idea is to be way more intersectional in your thinking, so you can start to identify where there are potentially gaps in your platform that allow this to happen, and vice versa, gaps in your platform that don't allow for accountability or the emotional support that a group would require. I think if you have especially interest in this one, there's a lot of things going on with since the uprisings and what happened on the Capitol, a lot of discussion of algorithm bias, especially when we look at LinkedIn and Instagram and posts that start to get pushed down. So this totally falls into that. And so for this, I have the abuse of power activity. And here is, again, while we use Palpatine, you get to role play as like a real life villain, because what I would like you to do is use your product or service and assume bad intent. So this means use it from the perspective of somebody who is trying to actively harm a group or community. So role play as, what if I were a racist? What if I were a misogynist? What if I were an ableist? Or what if I were, somebody who likes ketchup on like Chicago hot dogs? So think about what is like kind of the archetype of like the worst person that could use your product to inflict harm, and play out using your product or service or feature in that respect, because that will also give you a lens into saying, okay, if this happens, like, how does our product or service respond? How do we add support? How do we have accountability? How do we make sure that the person that's being harmed is empowered to either report it or make sure it doesn't like show up in their feed, kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to acknowledge that we have covered so much today. So I want to do a quick recap of everything we learned. So just like a key takeaway from every section. So key takeaway 1 is that there are more traumatized people than not. And because it's personal experience, there are a lot of people walking around with unresolved traumas, and they're using our products and services. So many of them are moments away from being triggered into a relapse or potentially self-harm. So that's the one big thing, like first thing I want you to remember from this talk today. 2, we know that many industries use trauma-informed care to reduce harm and improve outcomes. And so again, many organizations that use this have reported improved outcomes for the health of patients, for compliance, and just in general sense of like wellness while being there and using it. So the return, I would say like the return on investment of thinking about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed design is only positive. And last but not least, remember these 3 things, which is to think Black Mirror, think beyond the golden rule, and think about power. So taking these 3 elements into consideration for your next design will actually set you on the right path for starting to reduce harm to trauma survivors in your products. So the 3 key takeaways, again, I know we talked about a lot, so you'll have this recording, you will have these slides. I also wanted to share a couple of additional resources that I found really, really helpful just in my own exploration of trauma and trauma work. The first is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And it's actually one of the first of its kind work exploring the mind-body connection and how trauma changes the body. I think it was published in 1994. And actually I have a copy of it right here so you can see. Looks like this. This is the front cover. It is a really, really great work. It's very approachable. So I'm not somebody, who has a medical degree or MD or PhD or anything. And he really takes you through the connection, starting with where trauma work, the interest really got started, which was when Vietnam vets returned home. And that became kind of a catalyst for taking trauma more seriously. And he traces it through history of sort of the ebb and flow of interest in trauma and trauma-informed work. And also this University of Buffalo has What is Trauma-Informed Care. It's just a really great section on their website for social workers, and it's just an overview of trauma-informed care and its principles. So I have done a lot of talking, and so now it's time for you to do some talking. And I live by the only stupid question is an unasked question, so feel free to ask away.
I'm going to say, Teresa, I will start with a few questions that we have in
Okay.
the chat and the Q&A. Before I get to some of the questions, I know someone in the audience asked, did anyone catch the name of the person you mentioned who did the power imbalance in design work? So if you could.
Oh, yeah, I can pop that in the chat really quick once I find out how to get there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen briefly so I can do that.
Yeah, I think that's perfect.
So George I. He is the co-founder I just sent that to the panelists. It's like you'd think, even though I work in technology, that I would know how to use it. His name is George I. Or A. And he's co-founder of Greater Good Studio here in Chicago.
Cool. Now we do have one from Diane Baldwin. She asked her question early on in the talk. She said she designs an app that helps people overcome addiction to pornography. Most people come to our service in crisis. So how might we design for an app for addicts who are inflicting self-trauma and those who are supporting them, perhaps experiencing the trauma of a loved one with an addiction?
That is a really great question. And I also think too, if people are coming to your app and they're already in crisis, which I think is a really good way to frame it, because I want to say that anybody who has an addiction, they're not sort of self-inflicting trauma right there. It's that their fight, flight, or freeze has kicked in. And so I would say the best way to support them is make sure it's one in a non-judgmental and controlled and safe way. And I also think going through some of these questions to think about, well, why, starting to get out the root, why do they have this addiction? What is rooted under it? And then I would say for supporting family members, it's the same thing. Think about how you can share, say, these principles of trauma-informed care to educate loved ones to say, yes, your family member is an addict and that addiction is very, very harmful. And also here's ways in which, if you want to continue to support them, ways in which you can be trauma informed and start to unpack and say, hey, you're in control of what's going on. This is a non-judgmental space. We want to understand why you're seeking this out, not because there's something wrong with you, but we understand something happened. And I think that's the biggest question is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And this is kind of the likely outcome. So that's how I would say.
Okay. Great. We have another one here. They're wondering how universal design can incorporate trauma-informed principles.
Ooh, what a great question that I am not sure if I can answer, to be honest. Because I will say universal design is a term I have heard a lot of and has changed throughout the years. So I think if you could give me a little more of your summary of what universal design is, then I might be able to respond, because I feel like I actually haven't investigated this term in 5 years. So I'm sorry, I will admit my shortcoming in this.
Okay, so while our attendee maybe rehashes that question, we can go on to another one. Another question which came in a little earlier was, many products in the scrappy startup space have to go through a phase of being commercially stakeholder driven to prove ROI. So the time and the resources are low. So how do you justify usually white straight male managers, two usually white straight male managers, to let designers spend the time and the resources on the considerations and activities that you have proposed here?
So,
Mhm.
oh, go ahead.
It says the managers usually need to prioritize the company's bottom line, and they may not necessarily see the value in these types of exercises.
Sure. That is a hard place to be. And I would say the goal of especially the three considerations is stuff that you should be able to cycle in to like 15 to 20 minutes, right? So the idea is what's a quick rev that at least puts it on our radar so we can start to acknowledge it early. Because yeah, if you're in the scrappy startup world, I'll say not even the startup world, when budgets are super, super important, you definitely don't have all the time to think through this. So that's where these three considerations come in. I also think you can start to understand, depending on your application, think about long-term investment and planning, right? So if your application or product or service inadvertently causes somebody to harm themselves and they pass away, that is a big lawsuit for your company, right? So it's kind of about foresight planning. So you can spend the money now and give us like a couple days to do a sprint on this, or you can pay, you know, however much that lawsuit is later and make sure that that's okay. So I think that's kind of the one way you could propose it. And also I will acknowledge if they're not ready to listen, they're not ready to listen. But I think you as a designer, if you can fit it in, it's something that I would keep in the back of your pocket. So especially when I think about when we work in Jira about how we'd improve products or features, you could just start writing some stories like that and throw them in the backlog of being more trauma informed in your product and start doing and building the rationale.
Okay. Another question: if folks are resistant to thinking in the mind of a racist, how do you go about approaching this subject?
Oh, like if they're like resistant to like pretend that, I mean, that's okay. I mean, they should be resistant. I think if you can divorce yourself a little bit from it, I've always find that that really helps, right? So it's not about that you're getting into the mind of a racist and that makes you racist. It is like, I am a scientist and I am a researcher. And I am saying, okay, if I put on this cloak of this persona, and I were to do these things, like you also don't have to, like being in the mind of a racist, it's not that you actively have to like say or do the things that the people would do, but just to say like, oh, what would come to my mind to harm this person? And then how might that person respond? So think about it that way, where you can kind of separate yourself like you're playing a character. Because I would say too, this is where role playing is super helpful. You can be like, oh, here are, you know, you could create like the five cards, make it a game. Here are the 5 cards of the like most harmful people that could use our application, and everybody could just get assigned one. And then for 20 minutes, you like act as that person. Again, you don't have to say or do the things, but just think through how this person might like cause harm to whatever's coming up on your application.
Okay. Next question: what is the place of usability testing in trauma-informed design?
Ooh, I actually think that is a really good question. And I'm like, I have so many things racing through my mind. So give me just 1 second. I think taking some of these trauma-informed care principles and starting to put them into the usability testing, I think that's where you can start to layer on, right? If you are doing like long-term usability testing and you notice that there's not this idea, I think compliance is like a big word that they talk about in healthcare, that there's like a lack of compliance or a lack of completion to something that the application is suggesting. You could start to unpack that to say like, is it because it's poorly designed, or is it because it's not trauma-informed and people are resistant because we're giving something to a traumatized population and asking them to do something that will re-traumatize them? So I think usability testing would play a huge role in just starting to look at some of those metrics.
Okay. And this is one of our last questions, I believe. When making personas, what are your opinions on using images and pictures, especially when trying to create more diverse personas? And actually, this is a good one that is very interesting because I teach, part-time with general studies. And one of the students in the class asked, well, what happens for gender neutral? How do you actually develop a persona for a gender neutral customer or user?
Okay. So, I mean, I think pictures are always helpful. And I think too, when I think about like gender neutral, so my wife is actually a non-binary person. And you have to remember that, especially in that case, like non-binary people look like everybody else. So there isn't like a particular look. And I think that's sometimes where we get caught up with doing pictures and personas, is that we're trying to find whether this like archetype or sort of stereotype, I would actually say, when it comes to pictures. But using them helps, I think, humanize, but I also don't think they're necessarily necessary when it comes to creating them. So you can use them. And also it's like realizing, especially when you enter like sociological information, people look all kind of ways. So I think it just kind of depends on the user of your application. And I also think too, you can, if you have a picture, right, and I'll speak from like the perspective of like being a member of the Black community, right? Think about like, am I using light-skinned people or dark-skinned people? And if I'm using dark-skinned people, how do I layer in colorism and things like that into my personas? So you can have a persona, give a photo, and then take that photo and maybe extrapolate it out a little bit more in your persona to say like, what are other ways in which things might come up or biases that people might have when this picture is being shared.
All right, so I think that we've got pretty much all of our questions answered. Thank you so much, Teresa.
Oh yeah, I just have a couple more things before we wrap up, but I did want to shout out again that if you want to go more in depth with this topic, again, in depth, either you liked it or you didn't like it and you want to learn more somehow, as Carmen mentioned at the beginning, I have a short course that's starting February 12th. It'll run for 4 Fridays. And then, sorry, I'm looking at my presenter notes and it's like nothing is ever complete. Like just like a successful human-centered design project, nothing ever ends, just like this. And I have much like the song from Lamb Chop. Yes. So this trauma-informed design today was just an intro. So we'll go in more depth in February. We'll actually rewrite some of these principles specifically for design. We'll look at heuristics and frameworks. So if you're interested in that, I would highly encourage you to sign up. And then just from my part, thank you so much, everybody, for coming and attending this talk. I will say I was very nervous about it, but it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart and I think very important. And so now I challenge all of you to like go forth and push your companies to do better and be more responsible. And then these are just a couple places you can find me on the web.
Okay, and I'm going to drop the link for you guys to register for her short course. I'm going to go ahead and drop that link in the chat. So feel free, again, like she said, if you want to get a deep dive, because this again was kind of like a introductory teaser, but if you do want to get a deep dive into this topic in particular, feel free to register for the short course. And here I am, I'm dropping this in the chat panel right now. So if you go to uxpa.org and you go to our international short courses, Teresa's is the one that's coming up in February. Again, like she said, it will be kicking off on the 12th. Do know that our course registration rates are half price now due to COVID. So take advantage of that for sure. And thank you guys. Nothing but great reviews, Teresa.
Thank you.
So very glad. This was a fantastic presentation. You are the first to have done this on our UXPA platform. So we are grateful for it. And I think that the topic is very timely and relevant. So
yeah. Thank you. And anybody, I will say, feel free to always, reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn as well, or shoot me an email. Like, I'm always happy to answer questions about this.
Yes, and definitely follow Teresa on LinkedIn. She's the jewel dropper.
I'm pretty spicy, so that's what I hear. I think I told someone my memoir was like, you will not be invited back. So.
All righty, guys, you all take care. The recording will be made available. So yeah, register for the short course. Take care and have an awesome weekend.
Bye.